Travel makes us happy, I hope. Travel empowers us. Travel gives us a sense of freedom. But all these positive feelings of happiness and empowerment and freedom are in contrast to the dark, bleak state of a lot of the world. This is not going to be a happy presentation. You have been warned. However, I do want to thank Rick for allowing me to have this presentation in 2 parts. The first part, the main part, is today, and then we will be having an online vote at the same time as I am speaking. And the results of this vote will be announced tomorrow afternoon, where we can reach some conclusions about what you all feel about the issues in hand, about dark tourism, and about whether we as travelers have any obligations, or maybe we don't have any obligations. That is for you to decide. And that is why I would like you to all have your phones in hand and have the link that Rick sent you open. Okay, ahaslides.com/dark poll. And while I'm talking, I will give you the signal when you can start voting. And you will vote on your phone and we will get your vote. Now, before we start, we need to define what is dark travel. Because maybe you don't really know, and this is a very all-encompassing term. But dark travel in general is visiting places which have to do with tragedy, which have to do with death and suffering. That is a very all-encompassing term. What is death? What is suffering? What is tragedy? And how do we link that in terms of time? Now, before the pandemic in 2018, there was a TV series called The Dark Tourist, which ran for a number of episodes, but unfortunately was then cancelled because of the pandemic. And some of the themes that they examined under Dark Tourist are the following. You can see we've got Medellin in Colombia, and they looked at the legacy of Pablo Escobar. They went to Fukushima to see what happened after the nuclear disaster there. They went to Milwaukee in the US, and there was a Jeffrey Dahmer tour. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the world's most famous serial killers. So they went to the bars where he used to pick up his victims. They then went to Kazakhstan, Kurchatov, for another nuclear entertainment program. They went to Cyprus, where we have the ghost town of Varosha in Famagusta, and they examined that. And they went to Johannesburg, to the Orania township. So this is a very mixed bag of very different places. And the result of this means that it's quite difficult to define exactly what dark tourism is. A visit to a cemetery technically is dark tourism. I mean, cemetery is definitely associated with death. However, if we go to cemeteries, and many cemeteries, especially in Europe or some of the Americas, they offer cemetery tours. So I remember a couple of years ago, we went to Vienna and had a very nice cemetery tour there, seeing the tombs of some very famous people. This is on the borderline of dark tourism because I don't think it really evokes the emotion of death, tragedy, and suffering. You know, I think in order for something to really be dark, it also needs to have something to do with emotion. Now, in my presentation today, I'm going to take 2 paths. On the one hand, I'm going to make you question whether you have an obligation as travelers to go to certain places because they are dark. And then in the second part, which is even harder, I'm going to ask you whether you should perhaps refrain from going to some places because they are dark. And that will make it very dark. let's start. Do we have an ethical obligation to go to some places because of what happened there in the past? Why may we have an ethical obligation? Well, first of all, we are not just anybody. We are travelers. Many of us are role models. Many of us have Instagram pages or YouTube, or we are influencers, and what we write matters. So this is point one. Point two, we often post happy memories or happy things in terms of travel, silly things. But I think it's very important to also note what is not happy. This is also part of travel, this suffering, this pain. Third point, very important, we need to remember the past. If we forget the past, then we will not be able necessarily to guide our future correctly. And fourthly, many of the people involved in these dark sites were stuck. They were basically in a cage. Obviously, they didn't want to be in this cage, but they were. And maybe we can do them the favor of extending freedom of movement where they couldn't. So I'm going to start the presentation with a country that some of you have probably been to, and that country is Sierra Leone. Who in this room has been to Sierra Leone? Okay, I'd say maybe a third. And you may recognize here the beautiful cotton tree, which is the kind of landmark of the capital, Freetown. And Sierra Leone is a very beautiful country, and it's known for its beaches, which are really among the best in Western Africa. Now, who here has been to a small place called Bunce Island? 3. Well done. You can see on the map where Bunce Island lies, so it's not too far from Freetown. You need to take the ferry across, and then you can take a boat and go down the estuary, and you reach Bunce Island. For those who like World Heritage sites, Bunce Island is also a tentative World Heritage site because of its historic importance. And why is Bunce Island important? Well, sadly, it used to be one of the main slave trade centers in the world back in the day, from the mid-18th century until the start of the 19th century. Many, many people were captured and taken into slavery, and this is where their detention center was before they were then shipped over to the Americas. It is estimated that about 30,000 people went to slavery after transiting Bunce Island. And when you go there now, you will see not really all that much. There is the ruins of the administrative center. But what made this very, very poignant to me was the stories that my very endearing fixer Andrew, who by the way had seen his mother and brother shot in front of his eyes during the Civil War. So he evoked the stories of the slaves and how they were in shackles in terrible conditions, how many of them didn't really make it, and they were just thrown into the water of the estuary, which was full of dead bodies. He made this very bleak and very dark. And why was Bunce Island so popular, if you want, with the colonial rulers? Well, it was popular because it was part of the Rice Coast. And the Rice Coast is the area which spreads from Senegal down to Guinea-Bissau, down to Sierra Leone. And it is known like that because the people who lived there knew how to do rice fields. So there were no rice fields further down to the equator, but in that area of Africa there were rice fields, and these skills that they had were very, very prized by the colonial powers. That is why they wanted these people to go to slavery. Now, my argument here, I'm not asking you to fly from Bangkok to Bunce Island. What I am maybe suggesting is that if you are already in Sierra Leone, if you go to Freetown, if you go and enjoy the beaches and the urban atmosphere and chaos and the local architecture of Sierra Leone, don't you perhaps owe it to all these people who were there and suffered, died, or were taken into slavery to then maybe also visit Bunce Island? Isn't that maybe your way of saying, I hear you, where they cannot really be heard? And this is where I'd like you to please get your phones and we start the vote, okay? And this is how it will go, all right? So you should now have on your phone a slide which says, in terms of Bunce Island, I feel I need to go, or I don't feel I need to go. And again, I'm not asking you to go from here straight to Bunce Island. The idea here is, if I am going to Sierra Leone, should I maybe also visit Bunce Island? Because this shows a certain amount of respect to the darkness. I'm going to move on to my second example. There are in fact 4. And this is a very different location and one where probably all of you have been. I imagine all of you know Croatia. Even if you haven't been, you've definitely heard of it. And here we have the beautiful town of Dubrovnik, which is one of the magnets for most tourists. However, Croatia actually has a number of interesting dark travel elements. Here you can see on the map 2 of those. At the far east is the town of Vukovar, that some of you may have heard of because of what happened there during the wars in Yugoslavia in the 90s. But the one I want to focus on is Jasenovac, which is on the border with Bosnia and about 2 hours drive from Zagreb. You very probably have not heard of Jasenovac because the Croats are not very eager to make this known. In 1941, when the Second World War, or the German powers dismantled and took over Yugoslavia, Croatia declared its independence as a puppet state under a local fascist government. And in the summer of 1941, they built Jasenovac concentration camp. Quite obviously, the main quote-unquote residents of this concentration camp were the arch enemy of the Croats, and that is the Serbs. This is the only camp of all the concentration camps in the Second World War that was not operated by the Nazis directly, because the local government in Croatia was so efficient and effective in exterminating its enemies that the Germans didn't need to get involved. It is estimated that about 85,000 people were killed at Jasenovac. The majority of those, about 60,000, were Serbs, but there were also Jews, Roma, and also dissident Croats who did not recognize or did not want to cooperate with the fascist regime. Now, what makes Jasenovac poignant? There is a big museum there today, but it's not easy to find. If you're driving there, you are going to need Google. There are no signs on the road that say this way to Jasenovac concentration camp. That is because I imagine that the Croatian authorities do not exactly want to remember the darkest time in their history. It's difficult to find, but when you do, you will be able to learn a bit about what happened there. There is a perhaps slightly kitschy monument which was built in 1976. You can see it in the background there. And this stone in the front of The photograph shows a recreation of where the barracks were. All of that has been destroyed. So I'm going to ask you to please move to the second part of the vote in terms of Jasenovac. Do you feel you need to go if you're in the neighborhood of Croatia, or do you feel that you don't really need to go? My third example, as is the fourth, are much closer to today. We move on to North Ossetia. And yes, it is a me in the middle of this photograph, wearing a rather ridiculous wig. This is at the airport in Vladikavkaz, where I met a local troupe which was going to do a cultural show. Now, North Ossetia is part of the Russian Federation. How many of the people here have visited North Ossetia? This is interesting to see. All right, so about 15-ish, I would say. And you have probably, if you visited recently, also been to one of the greatest sites there, sadly, which is Beslan. Beslan is only about half an hour from Vladikavkaz, and it is a site of one of the darkest stories of modern history. What happened there on the 1st of September 2004 is that school number 1 of the town was taken over by a terrorist group from Chechnya and Ingushetia. Here are some pictures of the memorial, or what is now remained of the school. These pictures here are not mine, because I visited Beslan in 2011 before they built this. So the terrorists took over the school. There was a siege by the forces, and the result of that, with about more than 1,000 hostages, was that 334 of them were killed. Now, we all hear about school shootings in different settings in the world, but this one is the deadliest. Maybe technically it isn't a shooting, in the sense that a fire broke out on day 3 when the forces of the government stormed the school. The gym caught fire, and in the resulting chaos, 334 people were killed, among which 186 children. Of all my travels, this has been the one that has made me freeze the most. And this is probably because, apart from the school site as well, they have built a cemetery which is also a memorial. And this is truly heartbreaking. When you go there, you see the pictures of the children who are aged between 8 or 12, up to 12 years old. Of course, some of the teachers, the adults, also died, and this is really difficult to imagine how human beings would do this to one another. But it is what it is, and this is another example of dark travel. So we move on to our third vote. In terms of Beslan, do you feel, if you're in the area, that you have an ethical obligation to go there? Or wouldn't you really care much if you went there? The last example I'm going to give, and let me say that these examples are not necessarily the most representative or even the most deadly. I'm giving them mainly because I have been to all 4, and also because they show the variety of different types of dark tourism that we can have. So the last example is an example of nature, because dark tourism doesn't only come by the human hand and the wars that we wage and the terrorism that we might have to face. It also comes when nature overpowers us and reminds us that, in fact, it is stronger than us. So the last example comes from Indonesia and Banda Aceh, which is at the northern tip of the island of Sumatra. I don't know if you've been there. This is in fact the main site to be seen, which is the mosque. What happened here on Boxing Day 2004 is, and you probably know this case, the tsunami. Okay, so the tsunami swept away and it affected a number of countries, including very distant Somalia. So you can imagine how strong this tsunami was, that on the one hand, it took over Indonesia, on the other hand, all the way to Somalia. However, Banda Aceh was the city that was most hit by the tsunami. It was by far the deadliest victim of what happened, and 1/4 of the city, more than 60,000 people, were obliterated in a number of minutes. Here you have some photographs. Again, these are not my own. You have some photos of the devastation that happened in the wake of this tsunami. What can you see there if you go to Banda Aceh now? Well, the authorities have been very good at building another poignant memorial, which is the Tsunami Memorial Museum, and the names of all the victims that are known are actually there. So I would say this is one way of understanding what happened. At the same time, there is a ship which is called the Apung ship, which was taken by the tsunami for a distance of almost 3 kilometers. On the way, it obliterated many houses, and obviously all the people in its wake were killed, and then it finally came to a standstill at some point 3 kilometers inland. And this has now also been turned into a tourist site of sorts. So if we move on with our survey, the question is, in terms of Banda Aceh, do you feel you need to go or not necessarily? Now, in all of this discussion, obviously nothing is black or white. We need to think of what other elements that make us decide, do we want to go? Should we go? Do we have an ethical obligation to go, or don't we? And here are some of them. Some of the things we need to think about. Timing. When are we going to visit? Are we going to go when there are dark, dead bodies still in the street? Are we going to go when there are people still devastated without food? Are we going to wait until the situation has been stabilized, or are we going to go much later? Attire. How are we going to dress when we visit such sites? Awareness level. How much do we really know about what happened there so that we can appreciate it, learn from what we see, and then possibly educate others? And what is our attitude? I will never forget my dear friend Per, who introduced me, who told me that he went to Auschwitz and there were 2 young ladies in front of the Arbeit macht frei sign in Auschwitz, and they were jumping into the sky trying to take the best photograph. Is that the way to visit? I'm not going to answer that. You decide. And what is the attitude of the locals if you do decide to go? Are the locals happy to see you? Are they welcoming? Do they want to share their stories? Do they want their story to be known? Or are they aggressive and would rather be left alone? Ultimately, what is your real reason for going there? Is it to make a post and say, look at me, I have visited this too? Or do you have a deeper reason? And my question is it okay not to go to some of these places and ignore them while we're enjoying our happiness, our empowerment, and our freedom? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the easy part of this presentation. The difficult part comes now. And before I start on the difficult part, which is actually going to suggest that maybe we shouldn't travel to certain places, I would like to show you two different models of who we want to be. Now, these are absolute models. Just like in any theoretical discussion, you usually have two extremes, and in reality, we are all somewhere in the middle. But for the sake of theorizing, which is something I seem to like, what is a worthy big traveler? Who do we really want to be? And here I'm going to propose two different models of this big, worthy traveler who we admire and we respect. Answer one. A worthy big traveler is someone who has traveled a lot and visited many countries and regions. He has a big travel score. The more respected, more difficult, the more respected. And I use he for simplicity. It could be she. Yeah? And answer two, a worthy big traveler is someone who has traveled a lot and through these travels has developed a bigger understanding of the world and his or her role within it, which means they have self-knowledge and self-actualization. And this is where we get to the really difficult part. And this difficult part is, do we have an ethical obligation not to go to certain places because they are just too dark? And if we go, we may be sending a very wrong message. And again here, I'd like to remind you all that you are role models, and that sometimes when we pose in places which are too dark, maybe the reasoning is, look at me, look where I am, look at me, I'm a daredevil. Is that who we want to be? We should not forget the present and what is going on in some places now. And so the question is, should there be a limit to freedom of movement, or should we just trample on everybody because we want empowerment, happiness, and freedom? There are two parts to this ending part of my presentation. I'm going to present very briefly. This is not going to take very long because I'm assuming that you know the basics. So this is just to make you think. Is it okay to go to active war zones? And remember, I'm not talking about your safety. This is not about whether these places are dangerous and whether you may get killed. If you want to get killed and you're suicidal, fine. This is about the moral, the ethical dimension. Is it okay to want to go to Gaza now? Now, you know what? I'm a traveler. I love to travel to new places. I don't have all that many left to go, and Gaza is one of them. And if someone told me today, hey, Harry, you can go to Gaza tomorrow, I found a way for you to go in, believe me, I would be very, 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 very tempted to go. But is it okay to go to a place where everyone is displaced and 45,000 people have already been killed? That's more than 2% of the population. Is that who we really want to be? Is it okay to want to go to Sudan now, where there's more than 14 million displaced people, and we don't even know how many have died? The estimate I read is at least 60,000, but that is definitely not an accurate count. And I know that based on our research, there's at least 7 people whose last UN country is Sudan. They are stuck and they want to go there now to complete 193. And I urge you to think about it. Is that okay, or isn't it okay? And then we have, of course, Ukraine. And Ukraine is split in two. We have the occupied territories, which are not under the government control, and where children have been abducted and taken away from their families, and all sorts of other horrors that we may not really know much about. And then we have the government-controlled territories. Is it okay to go there, or isn't it? We went there last year. Was it okay, or wasn't it? I don't really have an answer. And what I want you to do is to think about it. Think of who you want to be. And this is where things will get really difficult. And this is where I need you to start voting. I'm going to come up with 9 dark countries and regions. And as I go down on this list, I'm not going to talk about these countries. I'm going to assume you're an educated audience and you may understand why these are on the list. What I am going to say is a few side remarks. First of all, these are on the list because I believe that they are the most blatant example of places where we don't have human rights. The consideration for this list and the argument for them is not how dangerous they are, once again. We're not talking about danger. We're talking about moral responsibilities. So, and you won't have much time to vote, okay? Vote quickly. I am going to move on to the next one. So the consideration here is how many human rights do the people in these countries have? And is it okay for us to want to go? From an ethical perspective, is it okay? Please vote as quickly as you can. And I am taking a very Western perspective. I know a couple of people in our community who think the worst country is France. They have the worst, and who maybe even idolize places like North Korea. And everyone is very much entitled to their opinion. But I'm taking a kind of majority Western style approach. The other thing I want to say about these regimes or countries, I am not a hypocrite. I have also been to some of these places on the list, and I have been there recently. And so I want to give you my reasoning so that you can see it from my perspective, why I chose to go to a place or why I chose not to go to a place. The one example I'm going to give is the one that comes after this country, and that is Myanmar. I haven't been to 2 capitals. One of them is the capital of Myanmar. The other one is Ottawa, by the way, which I want to leave last. So I was very tempted to go to Myanmar as a side trip, before or after ETF. But something inside me told me, Harry, there is a really ugly war going there. You don't really know what is going on there. You don't know how suppressed the people really are. And I preferred not to go. I reached the conclusion that this is not the time for me to go, and it can wait. The other example from my experience, which is coming in a couple of countries, is Syria. I had been to Syria 3 times before the civil war in Syria, and I loved it. Syria was in my top 5. Great people, great food, great history, great prices. I couldn't fault Syria on anything. An amazing place. But then the civil war happened, and it was as dark as it gets. And I just felt, I don't want to go. I had very positive memories, and I did not want to spoil them. So I ignored Syria. And then many people in the travel community were going. Many people finished and reached 193 in Syria. And please follow the vote while I'm talking. So in terms of Syria then, I heard my dear friend Lucy tell me, Fadi is this great guy. He's really great. He does a great job. And I really wanted to go to Bosra because I had not been there, and I knew it is an impressive World Heritage Site. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go for 2 days, only 2 days. This was my compromise with myself. I said, I'm going to go, I don't know how bad it's going to be, I don't feel comfortable going, but at the same time, let me give it a quick chance. And what happened in terms of that is that I fell in love with Syria all over again, despite everything. And for me, that was the sign that, you know what, it's worth going. I'm okay with it. I will not make a statement about the regime and the political situation, but the people are still the people I remember. The atmosphere, to a large extent, is still the atmosphere I remember. And so I am going to decide to go. This is our last country on the list. And this is also where our presentation is more or less going to end. But I have one more final question for all of you. So do look at your phones after you send your Venezuela vote. And the question is about freedom. Because we are here as travelers, partially because we love to be free. This is what defines us more than anything. And I am an Aquarian, which means even more so, freedom. It's all about freedom. But the question is, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you with the results tomorrow. I'm sorry I exceeded the